10 Horrifying Facts About Ancient Egypt. 1. A cholera outbreak was once caused by the use of wrapping paper made from bandages from mummies. There was a time when anything related to ancient Egypt was considered fashionable. Mummies were brought into Europe to be unwrapped at parties, and a large number of mummies were smuggled out of ancient Egypt. The truth is that there were so many mummies that no one held them in awe anymore even at the time. They were given very little historical significance. For this reason, obtaining bandages from mummies was not only cheap, but sometimes cheaper than paper. One enterprising US businessman decided in the early 1900s that he could save money in producing wrapping paper for food and imported old brown burial linen swaddles to pull the business off. Unfortunately for him, his plan went awry when people started getting cholera and the use of burial linen for wrapping food was banned. 2. Sometimes servants were put to death to be buried with their dead masters. Some have heard of legends before that servants of pharaohs and other important persons in the history of ancient Egypt were often killed by ritual rites and buried with their dead so that they could serve them in the afterlife as well. Many people today will tell you that this is pure Egyptian mythology, but the truth is that the reality is much more disturbing. Although the practice of ritually killing servants and placing them in tombs was not discontinued until the end of the ancient Egyptian era, sacrificing servants was once an integral part of their society. Although those who were sacrificed in this way did not necessarily feel that they were being killed. The ancient Egyptians had a complex relationship with death and were obsessed with the idea of continuing to live after death. In some ways they were much more obsessed with life than they were with death. Those servants who were sent to death and buried with their masters were considered privileged because they were allowed to follow a powerful figure into the afterlife to serve there as well. Yet it must have still worked on their nerves to know that your fate depended on the accidental death of the person you worked for. 3. In Europe, mummies were widely consumed as medicine. For most people, cannibalism is literally the worst taboo imaginable. The very thought of eating human flesh, even in circumstances in which there is no other choice, is something that would instantly turn most people's stomachs. Even when it comes to cases like what happened to the Donner Party, when the Illinois settlers led by J. Donner, cut off by snow in the mountains, were driven to extremes and ate those who had already died, people talk about it in whispers and with horror at the very prospect of facing such a monstrous decision. Back in the 1600s and 1700s, however, Europe was plagued by a frenzy of people eating various parts of human flesh in an attempt to cure various diseases. This began with those who chopped up mummies into pieces and added them to tincture, claiming it could cure all kinds of diseases, but ended with people eating blood to cure blood-related diseases, and even pieces of shattered skull to deal with brain diseases. 4. Whoever did not honor the sun god was sacrificed. Violent crimes were quite rare in ancient Egypt, but one of the worst crimes that could be committed was any form of insulting or disrespecting the sun god. Anyone who harmed, vandalized, or plundered a temple, or was in any way found guilty of an offense against the sun god, was usually sentenced to be burned alive. This punishment applied only to those who committed the greatest crimes, and was usually accompanied by a ritual of sacrifice to the gods. While the ancient Egyptians rarely practiced human sacrifice, this was one exception. While being burned alive is painful enough from the start, it was considered the most gruesome death by all ancient Egyptians because of the ritual significance of the act. They firmly believed in the preservation of the physical body in life after death, and believed that the destruction of a person's physical flesh by burning left him no chance in the afterlife. While the gods could still technically intervene to help man, this was the worst punishment imaginable for a believer in ancient Egyptian society. 5. In ancient Egyptian police, beating confessions out of people was a common practice. Ancient Egypt had a well-organized system of laws and groups that essentially acted like the police, but that did not mean that everything was always actually fair. As in old European society, beating recognition out of people by force was very common. In fact, it was essentially standard practice. Usually, in order to beat confessions out of people, they were beaten with sticks, often on the soles, a torture known as bastinado. Those from whom confessions were extracted would not only confess to what they had done, but also tell them where anything they had stolen might still be hidden, as well as give up all their accomplices. These people may also have been beaten up in order to identify any other accomplices. Unfortunately, as in many flawed legal systems, it will never be possible to determine the number of innocent people probably punished for crimes because they were forced to confess to something they did not do. Unfortunately, false confessions under torture are incredibly common because a person is willing to do almost anything just to get the torture over with if it is painful enough. 6. A person who broke the law was considered guilty until proven innocent. One of the cornerstones of the modern legal system is the principle of the presumption of innocence. A person is innocent until proven guilty. This is one of the reasons why many people have long praised Western legal systems, where at least a person gets a fair and very speedy trial, and where he knows that the system prevents his guilt even before he is given a chance to defend himself. And while ancient Egypt had a fairly advanced legal system, this is something they particularly lacked. In their legal system, the guilt of the accused was presumed from the beginning, and it fell on the accused himself to prove his innocence. While judges always did their best to be objective, beatings were common to prove guilt, as we mentioned earlier, and were more likely to be applied to the accused, even though they might have been innocent. Even witnesses could be beaten if it seemed to the judges that it was necessary to obtain additional information about the case at hand. Although there is no evidence that the ancient Egyptians regularly abused this system by falsely accusing each other, it seems that the system was of much greater benefit to those who abused it than it should have been to the innocent. 7. Sometimes the guilt of a person accused of a crime was determined by the magic of an oracle. In the last days of ancient Egypt, the clergy began to exert more and more control over the daily life of the Egyptians and the decisions made by the rulers. The influence and power of the priests over ordinary citizens increased steadily with each passing year, and soon they were consulted far more than they had been before. Those in power knew far more than they asked the priests, because they were believed to have the ability to contact and receive the support of the gods and could potentially influence a large number of people to do their bidding. This meant that in the last days of ancient Egypt the priesthood found themselves involved in judicial affairs. They would bring a statue of the sun god and put papyri in front of it with different answers for important decisions, usually 2 documents in court, deciding guilt or innocence. The statue had to turn to face the correct papyrus, demonstrating the will of the gods. Of course, this gave the priests the ability to manipulate the movements of the statues, and essentially decide court cases based on their own opinions and whims. Unfortunately, this meant that many ancient Egyptians, while on trial, depended on the whim of a rogue priest, someone who was believed by everyone but who probably knew very well that whatever he said would be taken as the will of the gods. 8. Taking measures to prevent pregnancy used to be a terrible spectacle. Today, in order to avoid unwanted pregnancies, people who are not ready at this point in time to continue having children use various means of contraception. And, as many people know, birth control has been around for many thousands of years. Scientists have evidence of the use of sheepskin condoms as far back as antiquity, and the ancient Romans are said to have used plants for birth control so often that they disappeared entirely because of it. However, most of these methods were fairly reasonable ways of preventing pregnancy, especially compared to those used by the ancient Egyptians. Ancient Egyptians believed that mixing most of the honey with the addition of crocodile dung, which was then coated around the vagina, was the main way to avoid pregnancy. For some reason they thought it was an effective spermicide, though in fact it further increased the likelihood of getting pregnant. While it's understandable that they believed it worked as a contraceptive, based on their knowledge at the time, it's still eerie to imagine how often they had to smear crocodile dung on their most intimate body parts. 9. Capital punishment in ancient Egypt was rare but extremely cruel. Life in ancient Egypt could be quite brutal, and beating, as we have mentioned several times before, was both a method of obtaining confessions and a common punishment. However, while many people know that ancient Egypt could be quite severe in terms of punishing criminals, like much of the ancient world, they were against the senseless imposition of the death penalty. Although such punishment existed in law, it was very, very rarely used. In fact, there was even a time period of about 150 years when the death penalty was not officially sanctioned for crimes in ancient Egypt. However, when someone committed a fairly serious crime, such as murder or treason, the death sentence to which they were sentenced was quite cruel. Although it was mentioned earlier that burning alive was the punishment for grave crimes against the gods, there were other forms of capital punishment that were just as painful and horrible: beheading, drowning, and even impaling. 10. The legends of the curses of the mummies of ancient Egypt continue to excite the minds of scholars. Countless legends and stories tell of the idea of mummies being cursed, and the general idea goes much further than many think. Even before the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, there were already stories of revenge on mummies whose remains were disturbed. However, the most popular legend claims that 26 people participated in the opening of the tomb, and then all began to die under mysterious circumstances, including the expedition leader, who died very quickly from blood poisoning. Some have speculated that there may have been a strange disease leading to blood poisoning, but most scientists have dismissed this version, pointing out that it doesn't stand up to criticism given that only 6 of the 26 people involved with the tomb died shortly after it was opened. However, while there is no logical evidence for the existence of curses, this does not mean that the ancient Egyptians did not practice it. Many tombs have various symbols around the perimeter, cursing those who disturb the remains of those lying in them, in the hope that vicious animals such as lions or snakes, or even the gods themselves would punish them.